No one ever tells you how love can quietly unravel your sense of reality, like a moth drawn to a flickering lamp, oblivious to the danger. I was 29, lost in the shadows of grief, my mind a fragile mosaic of memories I couldn't quite piece together anymore. The world outside my apartment was a muted blur. Stillness, silence, and the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. I often sought refuge in the small independent bookstore down the street, a place that smelled of musty pages and faded ink, where the only sounds were the whisper of pages turning and the distant hum of the city beyond. One rainy afternoon I wandered in, the droplets tapping rhythmically against the glass, a soft percussion against the quiet. I remember the way the dim light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that danced along the shelves. My eyes fell on a tall, lean man browsing nearby, his fingers trailing along the spines of books like a silent prayer. He looked up suddenly and our eyes met, an instant electric connection that felt almost scripted by fate. His gaze was intense, too deliberate, as if he'd memorized every detail of my face before I even knew it. He approached slowly, voice smooth and rehearsed, yet oddly warm. "You have a poet's eyes," he said, voice low, almost conspiratorial. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I blinked, caught off guard, feeling the faint tremor of a thrill I'd long forgotten. His hand reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from my face, the gesture intimate yet invasive, and I wondered if I should pull away. Instead, I stayed still, mesmerized by how his gaze seemed to see into the dark corners I kept hidden. The store's overhead light flickered once, twice, casting shadows that flickered like ghostly whispers. I noticed the faint crack in my coffee cup, a subtle fissure that seemed to mirror the fragile tension between us. In that moment, I felt the strange pull of possibility, as if an unseen thread was tying my fate to his. He leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a whisper. "I can see your future," he said softly, a cryptic promise that sent a shiver down my spine. There was a strange familiarity in his words, as if he'd known me long before we met, like a poem falling silently between the shelves, unnoticed but somehow meaningful. I wondered if I was merely lost, craving connection amid the chaos of my mind, or if I had stumbled into something darker, more insidious. The red flag was subtle, an over-the-top compliment, rehearsed like lines from a play, but my heart fluttered with naive hope, ignoring the warning bells that began to toll in the back of my mind. As I left that day, the rain continued to fall, each drop a reminder of how easily I could be swept away by something beautiful and terrifying all at once. I didn't know it then, but I was already being watched, caught in a web woven from shadows and light, unsure whether I was stepping toward or away from myself. And as I glanced back once more, I wondered if that encounter had been a beginning, or the first goodbye to any sense of safety I once believed I had. He remembered small things I said that I didn't even think anyone noticed, and he repeated them back to me later as if they were treasures only he could keep. It was like he saw a secret part of me that I hadn't even fully recognized myself, and in that moment I felt seen in a way I never had before. One night, I mentioned how I loved the smell of rain on dry earth, and the next day, he brought me a tiny jar of soil from a park near his place, saying it reminded him of that moment. It was oddly intimate, as if he was collecting pieces of me to hold close, to keep me tethered just a little more tightly. He shared stories about himself, two vulnerable confessions that seemed designed to match my own. I remember him talking about feeling lost in the city, about how he'd spent years searching for something he couldn't define. His voice was low and steady, and I felt like I was the only one in the world who truly understood his pain. It was strange how easily I believed that, how his openness made me think we were threading together a rare, fated connection. No one else saw the world like I did, he'd say softly, as if that alone made me precious, irreplaceable. His praise often carried an odd possessiveness that I brushed aside as devotion. "No one sees the world like you do," he whispered one night, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "That's what makes you different. Special." It felt like a gift, a reassurance that I didn't want to question. But then came the gentle, almost casual questions about who I texted or who I met up with. "Do they really know you like I do?" he'd ask, voice quiet but steady, as if he was trying to carve out a space in my life that only he could occupy. I rationalized it as his way of caring, an intense form of devotion, not control. After all, love was about closeness, wasn't it? He began to mirror my gestures unconsciously, leaning in when I did, touching his hand to his chest whenever I mentioned feeling vulnerable. One evening he handed me a small, delicate flower, its colors mimicking the tattoo I wore on my wrist. "It's like us," he said softly, "fragile but resilient." I felt my heart tighten, caught between tenderness and a strange unease. We sat silently for long stretches, the quiet stretching between us like a fragile web. Despite the stillness, I felt exposed, as if he could see every corner of my mind. In those moments, I started to adapt myself to meet his emotional needs, answering his texts faster, canceling plans without thinking, eager for his approval. I was desperate to keep him happy, to make sure I wasn't disappointing him, though I didn't fully understand why that mattered so much. My thoughts twisted into knots, convincing myself that this was love, that his attention was a rare gift. Yet, a small voice in the back of my mind warned me, fragile and distant, that I was losing control without even realizing it. Sometimes I wondered if obsession was just protection in disguise, if feeling so deeply connected was safe, or if I was slowly slipping into something darker, something I couldn't quite name. He made me feel like I mattered more than anyone else ever had, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming something else, something smaller, more fragile in his hands. And as I looked at that flower, that symbol of our fragile bond, I couldn't help but think, if this is love, then what am I giving up in exchange? My days started to feel like smudged chalk, something once clear and sharp, now blurred beyond recognition, impossible to trace back to any certainty. It was as if my world was slowly being erased, replaced by a muted version of itself, where every detail was tinged with doubt. I noticed his presence everywhere, not just physically but in the way my routine was subtly morphing, as if he was gently rewriting the script I thought I was following. He began dropping by unannounced, always claiming he was in the neighborhood, as if coincidence alone brought him there. His visits became more frequent, and I started to feel a strange comfort in the familiarity of his presence, even as I sensed a tightening grip. His voice messages would arrive at odd hours, checking my location, asking who I was with, making sure I was taking care of myself. It was as if he was monitoring my every move, cloaked in concern that felt more like a tether than love. He suggested I cut back on my friends and family, saying they only added stress, that I didn't need that chaos. His words slipped into my mind like a soft whisper, convincing me that he was protecting me from myself. Slowly, my schedule aligned with his whims. Meals became his choice, and my resting hours shrank to fit his idea of what was best. He'd say, "You need to rest more," and I'd find myself retreating into silence, accepting it all without question, as if my own instincts had been muted. Sometimes I'd catch myself questioning my memories. The other day, I told him about an argument I'd had with a friend, but he looked at me with a gentle, almost confused expression. "I never said that, babe. You're misremembering again," he'd say softly, as if my perception was flawed, warped by my own mind. I'd try to hold on to the fragments of reality I clung to, but they often felt fragile, like a wallpaper peeling in a room no one cared to look at anymore. My thoughts were becoming fragmented, slipping into shadows I didn't want to explore. My days felt like a room with peeling wallpaper. What was once familiar was now ragged and torn, the edges curling away from the truth. I'd laugh at myself, even when the tears threatened to spill, as if my laughter could hide the growing ache inside. I rehearsed responses, carefully crafted words to keep the peace, to stop him from questioning me, from seeing the cracks. Inside, I kept telling myself he was just scared of losing me. But why did it feel like I was the one disappearing? Why did I feel so small, so quiet, as if someone was turning down the volume on my life? Every attempt to hold on to my sense of self seemed futile, like grasping at shadows. I wondered if this was love, if love could feel like this. Yet inside, a voice whispered that I was losing myself piece by piece, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on before it all vanished completely. Maybe this was love, I thought, but why did I feel so alone inside it? Each time I stayed silent, I wondered if I was choosing peace or surrender. And that question gnawed at me, growing heavier with each passing day, as the invisible threads of control wound tighter around my mind. Every small act of defiance felt like surrendering a piece of myself. I deleted my favorite social app without a second thought, convincing myself it was for his peace of mind, that it was just a harmless gesture of compromise. But deep down, I knew I was emptying out parts of who I was, little fragments I'd held onto for years. I told myself I was doing it for love, that I was being considerate, but the ache in my chest told a different story. Sometimes I'd skip celebrating my own birthdays or achievements because he didn't feel like going. I'd sit at home, silently convincing myself that it didn't matter, because what mattered was him, his comfort, his needs. I'd hide photos of myself from before, tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened. The mirror I used to check my reflection in became a stranger's face I avoided. Every time I did these things, I felt a prick of guilt, a whisper that I was betraying who I was, but I silenced it with the thought that maybe I was just making things easier for him. That was what love looked like now, giving up the parts that didn't fit into his world. He never yelled, never demanded outright. Instead, he'd gently suggest I was changing, that I used to be more loving, more attentive. Sometimes he'd praise me when I kept quiet or gave up something I once cherished, as if my silence was a gift. I began to confuse obedience with affection, believing that doing what he wanted was the same as loving him. It felt easier, less complicated, like submitting was a way to keep our fragile connection intact. But inside, I was shrinking, becoming a softer version of myself, hollowed out by unspoken compromises. He'd say I used to be more caring, and I'd wonder if he saw the same person I used to be. My phone was always on silent, hiding messages I once would have answered immediately. I stopped wearing that old, vibrant necklace because it didn't match his taste. Small sacrifices, I told myself, just signs of growing up, of being considerate. But each one added weight, a subtle erosion of my independence, a quiet erosion of my sense of who I was. He'd say I'd changed, that I didn't care enough anymore. I'd smile and nod, feeling the words stick in my throat, unsure whether I was convincing him or myself. I thought I was showing love by giving him what he wanted, even if it meant losing myself in the process. I was becoming the echo of someone he approved of, soft, compliant, invisible. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a mirror I'd forgotten to hide, and I'd wonder if I still existed beyond his gaze. My reflection felt distant, like a ghost of who I used to be, fading further with each day. I didn't recognize myself anymore, just a careful shadow, carefully curated to keep him content. I couldn't hear my own thoughts anymore, just the faint, soothing hum of his approval, drowning out everything else. I smiled for him, but I don't think it reached my eyes. I wondered if I was still me, or just the version he needed me to be, hollowed out and subdued. Every choice I made seemed to chip away at my own reflection, until I was left with a fragile, trembling shell. And as I sank into this quiet surrender, I couldn't help but feel the edges of my identity dissolving, a faint crack forming deep within. I didn't know how much more I could lose before I became nothing at all. I woke up, or maybe I didn't. The room felt like a dream drifting into a fog, colors bleeding into each other, shapes dissolving at the edges. I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror, but it was a stranger's face, smudged, unfamiliar, as if I had been erased and replaced overnight. My own eyes felt hollow, like windows boarded up against the world. I clenched my fists, trying to remember who I was, but the memories flickered and vanished, like shadows slipping through my grasp. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of my phone, and everything had changed. The wallpaper was no longer mine, but a swirl of muted grays and deep reds, like a wound bleeding into my screen. I reached for my journal, but it was gone, replaced with a new one, pristine, blank, waiting for me to write what he wanted me to believe. My playlist had been deleted, replaced by a track he curated, a soundtrack I no longer recognized but felt compelled to listen to, as if my own taste had been erased. His voice echoed in my mind, soft, commanding, sometimes cruel. "That never happened," he'd whisper when I hesitated, dismissing my memories as if they were lies. "You're being dramatic," he'd say when I tried to explain what I felt. Every word he uttered seemed to carve a new layer into my psyche, rewriting the story I thought was mine. He'd removed contacts from my phone, saying it was for my own good, though I couldn't remember why I'd needed most of them in the first place. He made decisions for me, as if my voice was no longer valid. He'd erase parts of my past, distorting what I remembered, casting shadows over what I once believed to be true. Inside, I felt two voices fighting for space. One, still tangled in the illusion of love, clung desperately to the fleeting warmth he provided. The other, quieter but persistent, screamed for escape, for clarity, for the girl I used to be. It was like living in a house with two mirrors facing each other, each reflection fracturing into endless shards, none of them complete. Sometimes I'd hear my own thoughts, soft, hesitant, almost foreign, like they belonged to someone else entirely. I was repeating his truths, not my own, as if my mind had been rewoven in his handwriting. Even my thoughts felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone I didn't recognize. I was being rewritten in invisible ink, my identity fading into a ghostly script I couldn't control. The more I tried to hold on to myself, the more I felt slipping through the cracks. I'd catch glimpses of who I was, small flickering moments of recognition that vanished before I could grasp them. Maybe I hadn't vanished yet, but I could no longer remember the girl I used to be. Her voice was muffled, distant, like she was whispering from underwater. Sometimes I wondered if she was still in there somewhere waiting to be found, or if I had already disappeared, swallowed by the shifting shadows of his control. My reflection no longer felt like mine, and my thoughts no longer felt like my own. I was dissolving into a version of myself that he had carefully crafted, a fragile shell, barely holding together. And in the silence of that realization I understood. If I was still in here, I couldn't find her anymore. My reflection had begun to move out of sync, as if it was a ghost trying to escape its frame. I stared into the cracked mirror, watching my face warp and ripple like a disturbed pond. For a moment I wondered if I was seeing myself or a distorted echo, a fragment of someone I once knew. The glass felt cold, unyielding, yet it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, mimicking my heartbeat, offbeat, irregular. I reached out to touch it, but my hand trembled, and my fingers passed through a ghost that wasn't quite there. Every day blurred into the next, yet I struggled to recall how long I'd been confined in this space. Did I wake up yesterday or 10 days ago? Time had become a silent specter, slipping through my grasp. I found myself reading my handwriting, notes I'd made in moments of clarity, and couldn't recognize the words or the person who inked them. My own script looked alien, a code I no longer understood, as if someone else had taken my pen and rewritten my thoughts in a language I'd forgotten. The world around me subtly shifted. Photos that once told stories of memories now vanished from their frames, leaving behind empty spaces that echoed with absence. Clothes hung in my closet, unfamiliar and ill-fitting, as if someone else had dressed me in someone else's life. I'd reach for my playlist, only to discover the songs had been replaced by melodies I didn't recognize, lyrics whispering secrets I'd never chosen to hear. The environment felt alive, yet hostile, like a set designed by a puppeteer pulling invisible strings. His presence seeped into my mind, more invasive than ever. I'd hear his voice when he wasn't there, soft, commanding, echoing louder than my own thoughts. It was as if my inner voice had been hijacked, replaced by his whispering contours. Sometimes I'd catch myself recalling memories that I couldn't be sure were real, scenes that felt staged, dialogues I'd never spoken, feelings that seemed implanted rather than genuine. I'd wake from restless sleep with flashes of images that didn't belong to me, scenes rearranged like a puzzle missing pieces I'd never seen. His influence had become a shadow inside my head, blurring the edges of who I was supposed to be. I questioned whether my memories were truly mine or his, whether the person I thought I knew had ever existed outside his control. I was losing the thread of my identity, unraveling into a tangled knot of stolen moments and borrowed thoughts. Even my dreams obeyed his unwritten rules. They were no longer mine but a maze he'd designed. Yet amidst this chaos, a faint flicker of resistance persisted. One day I found a photo tucked behind a loose brick, an image from my childhood, a face I recognized but had thought erased. I discovered a note, written in my own trembling hand, that dared to defy his dominance. It was a whisper from the past, a fragile reminder that I had once been whole, that somewhere inside me, a voice still fought to be heard. Memories surfaced, clumsy, imperfect, genuine, that didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed. Maybe I was still in there somewhere, buried beneath layers of manipulation, but I knew I'd need to remember before I forgot again, because beneath the silence, beneath the distortions, there was a whisper, soft but persistent, and I prayed it was me. My breath caught in my throat but no sound came out. Instead I felt it, like a tidal wave crashing inward, tearing through the fragile wall I'd built around myself. I stared at the screen, at the video that played on loop, and something inside me shattered. It was me sleeping breath shallow, eyes closed, and then I saw him, my reflection in the corner of the frame watching me. Not from a distance, not in memory, but right there in the dark, recorded forever. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. I had been watched every moment of my sleep, every breath I took, captured and stored like some twisted trophy. And then the worst part, no, the only part one could focus on, was the voice that whispered from the shadows of my mind, telling me I was never safe, never real. My hands shook uncontrollably, trembling as if my skin was trying to peel away and escape. I clutched my head, trying to hold myself together, but the weight of it all pressed down so hard I thought I might drown. It was as if my mind had split open, the cracks spreading wide, spilling every secret I'd ever tried to hide, every lie I'd told myself. I remembered that day in the mirror when I saw my reflection, shattered, fractured, like the glass I'd seen in that broken mirror last week. I thought it was just a crack that would heal, but now I knew it was more. I looked into my eyes and saw the ghost of someone I didn't recognize. Who was she? Had she ever existed outside his control? Or had I been living inside his illusion all along, my own face just a mask he'd reshaped? The thought made my stomach turn. I felt my mind twist, questioning everything, my memories, my sense of self, my very existence. A voice, a whisper, faded in and out, whispering that I was nothing, that I'd always been nothing, that I had no right to call myself alive. I clung to the remnants of my thoughts, but they felt fragile, like dust in a gust of wind. That's when I saw the small, worn photograph I'd hidden in my pocket, folded tight. It was me, smiling, innocent, before all of this began. But now, even that felt distant, a ghost of a ghost. I looked at it and wondered if I'd ever been real, or just a reflection he'd manipulated into believing was myself. I felt a numbness creeping over me, a cold surrender. This wasn't fear anymore, it was surrender. My mind had been eroded so gradually, I hadn't even noticed the cracks spreading. Until today. Today I saw through the illusion. Or maybe I'd always been blind. Maybe I'd never had a choice. I stared at the ceiling, fists clenched, tears streaming down my face, feeling the weight of everything collapse inside me. I whispered my own name, barely recognizing it, and wondered if it still belonged to me. If it ever had. A part of me wanted to run, to hide, to scream for help. But I knew I couldn't move yet. Not fully. Not without falling apart completely. I was standing on the edge, teetering over an abyss I couldn't see. And I knew that whatever choice I made next would define whether I would break free or drown inside his shadow forever. My body trembled, my mind a battlefield. As I stared into the void that was my reflection, questioning if I was still alive or just a ghost haunting the ruins of myself. I was making tea, the familiar ritual comforting in its routine, when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. I reached for it absent-mindedly, expecting a notification from my quiet world of silence. But instead, a message appeared on the screen. "Are you okay?" It was from a number I didn't recognize, yet somehow I knew it was meant for me. My heart hammered, a cold dread creeping in. How had someone found me? How had I been watched so closely? I hesitated, then scrolled through my photos, expecting to see the usual clutter. Images of books, empty streets, my own reflection. But one picture caught my eye, and everything shifted. It was a shot of me asleep, taken from a strange angle I never remembered posing for. I stared, unseeing, as the room in the photo felt wrong, dimmer, distorted. How long had he been watching? How many times had I been captured like that, unaware? My stomach clenched as I looked around my room, suddenly unfamiliar, as if the walls had rearranged themselves in my absence. A flicker of memory surfaced, a fragment of voice, cold and intimate, whispering things I couldn't recall consenting to. My hands moved instinctively, brushing my hair with a rhythm that was mechanical, not my own. My reflection in the mirror was cracked, yet I stared into it as if I could find the truth behind its fractured surface. The glass seemed to mock me, alive with silent accusations. I reached out, trembling, and saw the frame on the shelf, tilted out of place though I had never touched it. It stared back, eyes dark and watchful, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. A sense of disconnection washed over me, then a sharper realization. A call I never made, a dress hanging in my closet I had no memory of choosing. As I touched my own handwriting, I saw it was altered, letters slanted, words jagged, as if written by someone else. The air grew thick, suffocating. How long had this been happening? How long had I been living in a story I didn't recognize? I felt the weight of unseen eyes, the quiet, relentless truth pressing down. It wasn't love. Not at all. The love I believed I'd shared was a lie. He hadn't fallen for me. He'd built me. Sculpted my image, erased what he didn't control, and stitched his obsession into every detail. Every "I love you" was a lock clicking shut, sealing me in a cage I'd never seen. The love was a trap, an illusion of intimacy designed to keep me compliant, to erase my real self. I realized I wasn't just feared or manipulated. I was manufactured, a construct of obsession. The silence in my mind cracked open, revealing the hollow core of what I'd believed. I wasn't his. I never was. And knowing that, I felt his fear because I was slipping free, even if only in my broken perception. The walls I'd trusted, the memories I'd held, were all part of his story. I'd been written over, erased, rebuilt in his image. A quiet, terrible decision formed in the depths of my fractured mind. I could no longer trust the space around me, the reflection staring back, or even myself. The world was no longer a place of safety. Something had been wrong for so long, and I had only just begun to see it clearly. I didn't know what came next. Perhaps escape, perhaps destruction. But I knew I had to break free from this carefully crafted nightmare. The truth was finally bleeding through the cracks, and I could feel the final rupture approaching. I waited until I heard his breathing slow. Then I reached for my phone, trembling so badly I thought I might drop it. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat echoing the frantic pounding of my thoughts. This was it, my chance, fragile and trembling but real. I decided I couldn't stay here anymore. Not like this. I had to do something, anything to reclaim even a sliver of control. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The room was eerily silent, the darkness thick around me, pressing in like a suffocating weight. Every step felt surreal, like I was moving through a nightmare I'd never wake from. My fingers fumbled to unlock the phone, my mind racing with questions. What if he was already awake? What if he saw me? I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to move faster. I had to try. The hallway stretched out before me, shadows twisting in the dim glow of the night. Every creak of the floorboards sounded deafening. I pressed my back against the wall, listening. Silence. A false relief. Maybe I'd made it. Maybe I was finally going to do it. I slid my hand along the wall, searching for the door to the living room or the front door. My pulse throbbed in my ears, each beat a reminder of how deeply I'd been reprogrammed, how my instincts had been warped into paranoia. What if I was already too far gone? What if I'd forgotten how to escape? I reached the doorframe, hesitating, my breath hitching. My fingers, numb and trembling, brushed the handle. It was unlocked. I could walk out, could run. But then I remembered the cameras. I'd seen them, hidden in the corners, pointed at every angle. Did he know I was trying? Was this all just another trap? A sudden noise, my own heartbeat, threatened to drown everything else out. I froze. Was that a creak behind me? My mind spun wild, visions of him suddenly appearing, catching me in the act. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my trembling body. I was so close, yet so far away from safety. I had to do something, anything. In a rush of desperation, I grabbed the first thing I saw, a fragile, thin picture frame. I yanked it from the wall, shattering the glass and tearing the photo inside. It was a picture of us, smiling, innocent. I smashed it against the wall, the shards scattering like broken memories. It was a small act, but it felt like tearing a part of his control away, even if just for a moment. I could still feel his eyes on me, even in the dark. I knew I wasn't free yet. Not really. I turned to leave, but just as I stepped toward the door, I saw it, something glinting on the floor. A small black device. A camera, hidden underneath the table. It was pointed straight at me. My stomach clenched. He was watching. Always watching. I stared, frozen, as the reality sank in. I'd been captured, recorded, manipulated in ways I couldn't even comprehend. The walls around me felt like they were closing in tighter. I had cracked the glass, but I could still see him staring through it. I knew he'd know. And when he did, I wouldn't be ready. But I had to try. I had to break free, even if it was only a fragile, trembling attempt. Because deep down I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't run. Not yet. I just stood there, trembling, heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst from my chest. The room seemed frozen in time. the shadows stretching and twisting around me as if they were alive, watching. The weight of what I'd discovered, videos of me sleeping, the hidden camera under the table, his silent, lurking gaze, crushed any thought of escape. My mind raced, a jumble of fear, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How long had he been watching me? How much of my life had he recorded without my knowledge? The questions echoed in my head, each one more suffocating than the last. He was there, just beyond the doorway, silent, watching me with that unreadable expression. I could feel his presence like a heavy fog pressing down on me. I wanted to scream, to run, to shatter everything in my path, but my body refused to obey. My legs felt numb, my voice caught in my throat. I looked at him, and in that moment I saw not just the man I'd loved, or thought I loved, but the predator hiding behind a mask of charm. The mirror shattered in my mind, reflecting my fractured sense of self. Suddenly, I remembered the journal I'd kept, the photos I'd hidden, the small pieces of my identity I tried to cling to. The journal was gone now, but I remembered every word I'd written, every secret I'd confided in those pages, every hope I'd buried beneath layers of fear. I realized that those fragments of myself, once so precious, had been erased or manipulated, reassembled into a version he controlled. But even in the darkness, a flicker of defiance sparked within me. I reached into my pocket and clutched the small, crumpled piece of paper, the note I'd written to myself, the only thing left of who I was before this nightmare. His eyes finally flicked with a hint of something darker, excitement perhaps, or a sick satisfaction. I knew I had to break free, to shatter the illusion that had held me captive. I grabbed the glass figurine on the table and threw it against the wall, the shattering sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. His face twisted in anger, but I didn't care. I saw the camera under the table, a tiny blinking eye that had been watching me all along. That was the final straw. In that moment, I saw my reflection in the cracked mirror. Distorted, fractured, but still mine. I whispered my name aloud, louder than I ever had before. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, a silent vow to never let him own my story. With trembling hands, I grabbed my bag and ran, every step a defiance against the invisible chains he tried to forge around me. Now, as I write this, I am exhausted, my body aching with relief and residual fear. I don't know if I've truly escaped his grasp or if I've merely escaped the physical space. I carry his shadow inside me still, a ghost I can't completely banish. But I know one thing for certain. I am alive. I survived the darkness he cast over my life. Maybe I didn't undo all the damage, maybe I can't forget what I saw, but I will rebuild myself piece by piece. And when I hear his voice in my head, I whisper my own louder, because I am still here, still fighting, and somehow that's enough.